Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Eric. Today I'm going to talk about Back to the Future 3, which was released in May of 1990. So, just to kind of pick things up from the first film, just to talk about where the story's at, I'm going to get into some themes of Part 3 and also maybe reflect a little bit on the legacy of the series itself. But just to quickly pick things up, part two ended with Marty apparently stranded in 1955. We learned that Doc has been sent back to 1885. So part three picks up from there, where Marty is in the 50s. He goes back to the old Doc, or Doc who's in the 50s, and he gets a letter. Yeah, it sounds confusing already. He gets a letter from Doc who's in the past, right? And they learn where the time machine's at so they can send Marty back home. But Marty wants to go back to 1885 because he learns that Doc dies in 1885. He killed by one of Biff Tannen's ancestors, so Mad Dog Tannen. So Marty, being a loyal friend, wants to go back to save Doc so they can both go back to the future. So that's the setup for part three. Tonally, part three is very different from part two. I talked about some of the darker tones of part two, which really get into the pitfalls of time travel, dark timelines, and things like that. Three is different in tone, where it's, on the one level, it's a Western, because we spend most of the film in 1885, so there's a more slower pace to part three, and also a more just elegiac tone to that's running really throughout the entire film as they're wrapping up the story. And really, like the Western, it's interesting because, it considered a genre that was nowhere near what it was in the 50s and 60s, but it was would occasionally come back. Like, for instance, it came back in the 80s with a few movies like Silverado and the Young Guns movies. So the Clint Eastwood was still making some westerns like Pale Rider. So westerns never completely went away. We would see a little bit of a revival of the Western in the 90s, though, with Kevin Costner making his Westerns like Dances with Wolves and Wyatt Earp, and Tombstone, a popular Western from that era. So the genre would go through some revival, and I guess Back to the Future 3 was sort of on the vanguard of that, with clearly Zemeckis and Gale were big fans of Westerns, so we get to spend some time there and explore all the tropes and cliches of the Western, of the saloons and duels and outlaws and frontier towns. Like, we're in Hill Valley as the town is just getting started. So the film has just a lot of fun with that concept as we move forward. From a narrative perspective, part three is interesting too, is that it's more Doc's story than Marty's story. They're both given strong storylines, but Doc meets Clara, played by Mary Steenburgen, and who she was famously in Time After Time, which I reviewed, another time travel movie where she's with H.G. Wells, played by Malcolm McDowell. But here, she's another she's the love interest in this film, but I like her character. She takes initiative a lot in the film and brings a new element to the series, kind of a more romantic storyline for Doc, and it gives a whole different vibe to the third movie, and I think it worked well. It worked well. And Marty, and I think even on the commentary track, they mentioned how Marty and Doc sort of switch roles, where Doc is the one being ruled by emotion in this one, and Marty is often the voice of reason. So they still have to figure out how to get back, and we kind of get this steampunk finale where they have to push a locomotive, pushing the DeLorean, to the 88 miles per hour. So it's a really exciting climax that we get to part three. I think one of the big themes in this one is maturity in character, where I think Doc and Marty both mature. I think Doc comes to realize, time traveling has created more problems than solutions, and he sort of Doc kind of comes to a epiphany on that. And there's a whole storyline with Marty where he's quick to anger and makes impulsive decisions, and there's a big storyline about that of him being able to overcome his I guess his anger and his aggression if he's insulted, and learning that choices have consequences, as part 2 gets into as well, where we see future Marty and he's not doing so well because of the choices that he made. So the film does have more of both of our characters maturing a little bit as they get towards the end of the story. I think too, a few things about the ending of the film, and I should say, I think the nostalgia on this film is working on a lot of different levels. I think when people went to see this in 1990, there was already a nostalgia for the series starting to end. But I think now, over 30 years later, there's a whole new, I think, wave of nostalgia for the people who watch the film, where the character, the actors in their roles are aging now, and times have changed a lot since 1990. There's been, this is still before the internet. That's one thing, but that's just one of the things that's changed since these films came out. And these films too, they were liked by everybody, like all ages. Like Reagan, who was president, was famously quoting the first film in one of his speeches. So people of all ages did like these films, and they even tried to get Reagan to have a cameo appearance in the third film, because he was out of office by that point. But these films were very popular, with, as we talk about the tentpole movies, hitting those 4 quadrants of the ages and all that type of thing. So we're really kind of getting into the peak of the blockbuster era, where Spielberg and Lucas are still, Lucas is kind of out of the game at this point, but Spielberg is producing this film and still would have a few blockbusters through the 90s, but of course others would come along. In 91 we get Terminator 2, and we get Jurassic Park a few years later. So we're still in that blockbuster era, where just these films that would just draw in massive audiences. By the end of the 90s, that would look a little bit different. There were still blockbusters, but that would evolve kind of into something else as we get into the 21st century. So the Back to the Future movies kind of sit in this strange place, where they come right at that peak of the blockbuster era. Yeah, but just to talk about, and one thing, the story has an ending. Like the films do move towards an ending, and I think that's important. When, spoiler if you've not seen it, but at the end, when the DeLorean is destroyed, when Barney comes back by the train, that really was like a finality. Like, that was almost like signaling to the audience that the story's over now. The main engine, the DeLorean, is now gone. The DeLorean has become like a symbol of 1980s pop culture, maybe a symbol of analog era, a symbol of the future, the futuristic car. So destroying the DeLorean had, I think, for audiences then, big significance. It was, like I said, like the end of the story, no doubt. Although Doc has invented a new time machine as we get at the end, where we do get some sentimentality at the end, where Marty and Doc, kind of have their farewell. So there's that too. So like I said, a lot of nostalgia running through the film. I think one thing watching the films now is, as I talked about, we reflect on how much has changed since these films come out, and the fact that they do deal with time. Back to the Future movies are the big themes are about choices, how the choices we make affect our futures. That's such a big part of it. But the whole idea of time passing and how we deal with that, and when the time machine is destroyed, Marty has no. You can't go back and fix things anymore, right? You as we all are, we're kind of stuck living in linear time. So that's an interesting beat that we get at the end of the film. I think as for the legacy of the series, I think one thing to mention is that Zemeckis and Spielberg and Bob Gale, they're very protective of the IP or the property, you might call it, where if anybody wants to do anything with these films, they have to run it through the three of them. So they're well protected, which kind of makes these films set in stone because we live in the age now of reboots and sequels and re-sequels or like we're a glut with Star Wars movies and all the like IPs in the 1980s. Most of them have just been done so many times, like the Karate Kid movies and other ones are slipping my mind. But Back to the Future hasn't. It is protected, and I believe nothing can be done with these with the franchise until all the creators have passed on. So, which makes you wonder if how younger generations will perceive these films. I mean, will they just be looked upon as like kind of a dated relic of the 1980s, and maybe by that point there'll be no hunger for more Back to the Future stories in whatever form they take. I mean, I'm sure Universal is just chomping at the bit. As soon as they could get the go ahead from Spielberg or somebody to make more Back to the Future films, they'll do it. They would reboot these movies in a heartbeat. I'm sure of it, but they haven't, and that's kind of it's interesting to think about. That how they just kind of sit there back in the past, and nothing has been altered. There's no alternate versions. There's no extended cuts or anything like that. They're pretty much the same movies they were when they came out. So I think that's one interesting legacy of the series. So yeah. So for me, they're rewatchable. Of course, I grew up with these movies. These were, movies that you would just watch over and over again. You never got tired of them, and we process media much differently these days too. We don't rewatch movies like we used to. So that's changed as well. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all you want to see as we wrap up. Back to the Future series here. But anyway, I enjoyed talking about this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.